Morning, YouTubers. It's exactly 8:30 a.m. It's not quite Valentine's Day yet. It's the 13th, day before. Happy Valentine's Day in any case. Um, what I want to talk about here briefly is, for one thing, subsequent to Fuller's contribution, what has been its reception. He felt rather acutely that as being a very intuitive guy, that was his whole self-discipline, is to be intuitive, that the universe or the mind or whatever had gotten through to him and gotten him to see this importance of the tetrahedron as highly significant, and maybe that the future depended on our paying more attention to the kind of geometry he was developing, and that the whole numbers were important to him, like the cube of volume 3 breaking up into mites of volume 8, space filling. This would be the A modules, 1 over 24. By the way, I have a plane net. I was talking about plane nets in the last video I did, and I didn't have one showing, so let's flip to one. So he does all this work. This is the A and the B modules. So you fold those up, and then you can make mites and stuff like that. That's what I mean by a plane net. And sometimes we might start with the STL file, like we do in a different video, and do the S module. By the way, it's my ambient lighting, my dark theme today. So that means I don't have overhead light, and I use the light of the LCD basically on my face. That's part of it. So let me do a little bit of show and tell and talk more about Fuller's sense of urgency. What comes out in this book, which I've shared before, about Coxeter, to whom Fuller dedicated synergetics. What comes out in this book is they had an uneasy relationship, especially at first. They got to be friends. It didn't happen overnight. But one thing Coxeter, I don't think, ever really liked about Fuller was his sort of messianic message around tetrahedrons. Like, he's a geometer. He's not a religious preacher, Coxeter. He's not used to an audience full of people, really getting whipped up into a frenzy about how we need to pay more attention to the tetrahedron. That was just not his style or his message. So Fuller was kind of parting company with Coxeter in how strident he might have sounded to some people. Another book, Humans in Universe. This one's interesting for its reaching out or collaborating with Persia. That appears in all capital letters, as I recall, quite a few times. I haven't read this in a while. It's on my shelf. My website, Synergetics on the Web, also briefly appeared in a university setting in Tehran, I recall, at a polytechnical university or something for a while. And I was happy about that because we were young in the web world, and we were encouraging mirroring. That's what we call it. So that if one website goes down, you've got another one somewhere. So yes, by all means, mirror Synergetics on the web somewhere. Keep it running, because like you've seen, I've been talking to GoDaddy. I'm trying to keep it afloat. But these things hand-coded in the 1990s. They don't have SSL certificates. They're not TLS. If you're a Google, you're already squeezing those out of the search engine, so you're not going to find it that way. So my website is already getting pushed off stage because whatever. So mirroring, I encourage. Bucky, this is by Hugh Kenner. Again, James Joyce scholar, big in literary world, wrote the Pound era. Friends of Ezra Pound, right? Bucky was a friend of Ezra Pound way at the end, when Ezra Pound had already been caged and thrown in a mental hospital. Talk about someone who got rough treatment, right? But he was on the radio during the Second World War on the wrong side, as we say, right? He was very upset about all the pain and suffering being inflicted on Italians and Germans by the blockade, which we don't read about as much anymore, but a book called Human Smoke is good on that. Anyway, don't want to refight World War II necessarily, just Fuller himself is highly aware of history. I should get some more action going on here. I do speak about, high-speed trains, and that gets me connecting to Lyndon LaRouche a little bit. I'm interested in, he tells history a little bit similarly to the way Fuller does when it comes to hooking up the Phoenicians to the Venetians, but he doesn't also bring in the Vikings or Vikings as Fuller does. So, but there's overlap. So Fuller is into telling the story of history in his own way. He takes responsibility in that sense, and it's very like quirky, kind of unique to him how he tells it, and it gives context for what he thinks he's up to. I think, as someone who was proposing big changes in the world, it behooved him to write a world history. So the guy did a lot of work, is what I'm thinking. He wasn't a crackpot because he was so productive. And this attempt to smear him, character assassination, the way they do it is they say, well, he was a crackpot, of course, but because he was so good at ripping off other people, and because he would present their thinking as his, he managed to fool a small diluted minority into thinking he was a genius, whereas he was not. And you'll find that most people who participate in this kind of smear steer clear of all the synergetic geometry that I'm showing here, because this is clearly interesting original explorations, right? Not that he invented the space-filling rhombic dodecahedron, but that it would be the volume of 6 tetrahedrons. That's not still to this day taught in elementary school, and I think it should be. I don't think you should get a high school degree if you haven't studied the concentric hierarchy, at least a little. That's what I think. No one cares. That's what I think. But it's a point of view. I don't think, another way of putting it is, my ethnicity, like, let's just say the Quakers. The Quakers, being pacifists and wanting a bright future, they want their kids to at least know the Bucky stuff, right? American Transcendentalism, that whole branch of literature, Emerson, Thoreau, the Quakers belong in there too, New Thought. So to have our kids go to school and get zero of the Bucky stuff, that's not our heritage. That's not the melting pot as far as I'm concerned. So a good reason to set up private schools maybe, or just insist, hey, public schools, why don't you teach some American history? And hey, universities with your expensive student loans, why don't you teach too some American history? What a concept, huh? So if you didn't get any of this in school and you're paying off big debts, think about that. Think about how maybe you got caught up in some kind of political battle that you didn't know about. All right, that's my rousing speech for the morning. I hope it was interesting, and we'll talk to you again in the near future. Happy Valentine's Day again.